trustees and staff of CSMVS, we welcome all of you to our centenary year, and this is our third centenary lecture by our own Dr. Asok Das. He's our dear friend, philosopher, and guide. So he's going to talk about a very interesting topic, which is related to museum's history and very relevant to our centenary year. Before that, I'll just tell you about something about what we have done in this centenary year. The museum opened its doors to the public on 10 January 1922, and in this journey of 100 years, which was challenging and exciting, the museum has come a long way. It is changing with the ever-changing world, and change is good. As we prepare for our bicentenary, we will focus on three important aspects: more global and national collaborations, environment, and most importantly, research and education. Therefore, today, we express our gratitude to the scholar community of CSMVS, more particularly Dr. Moti Chandra, Mr. Kal Khandalawala, Dr. B.N. Goswami, Dr. Pratapaditya Pal, Dr. Ashok Kumar Das, Dr. Devangana Desai, Dr. Saryu Doshi, Dr. Kalpana Desai, Dr. Arvind Jamkhedkar, Dr. Jyotindra Jain, Dr. Robila Thapar, Mr. Neil McGregor, and Dr. Eberhard Fischer, among many others, for enriching our lives and helping this museum continue its tradition of research for 100 years. We thank our chairman, Mr. Eknath Shirsagar, the trustees of the museum team, and our friends for transforming the museum into a global institution. This is a centenary year, and it is a time to rejoice both the past and the present, our institutional values, people, and purposes, all with an aim to prod us to the future. On this occasion, we take the opportunity to felicitate two of our senior scholar friends and guides. Our first scholar is Dr. Asok Kumar Das, speaker of this evening and very dear friend of this museum. Dr. Asok Kumar Das has worked as a lecturer, University of Kolkata, Deputy Keeper, Indian Museum, Kolkata, and as Director, Maharaja Savai Mansingh Museum, Jaipur. He was appointed as Satyajit Ray Chair at Vishwa Bharati Shanti Niketan and Visiting Professor, Department of Art and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He was awarded the Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship, Andrew Mellon Fellowship, and Tagore National Fellowship. He has traveled widely as a senior visiting fellow at the V&A Museum, London, Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, Friel Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., Getty Museum, Los Angeles, Kuwait National Museum, and Museum of Islamic Art, Doha. He delivered lectures at many universities, institutions, and museums in India and abroad. His publications include books, papers, and articles on different schools of Indian miniature painting, especially Mughal paintings. He has also written extensively on the subject of museology and history. So, without keeping you waiting for today's centenary lecture by Dr. Asok Kumar Das, I invite him on the podium to deliver his lecture, CSMVS 100, A Personal Odyssey. Thank you very much.
Friends, I am really privileged to be here today as the third centenary lecturer of my beloved institution, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya. I am grateful to the trustees, Chairman Sri Sagarji, and the Director General Sabyasachi Mukherjee for inviting me to present whatever I thought would be of some relevance in the context of the centenary celebrations here. My association with this museum goes back to 1960, when I first came here as a student of museology with our Professor Kalyan Kumar Gangopadhyay leading a small group of 9 students here. And at that time, I just passed out of the ancient Indian history and culture and also law and took up museology. So my basic leaning at that phase of my life was, of course, on Indology. And I will tell you that what impressed me most during that visit was the recently discovered 9th minor rock edict of Emperor Ashoka. And of course, the other one, I knew it also, from my days of studentship of Indology, is the Dhyani Buddha image from Mirpur Khash. At that time, I was not aware of its real implication, and I would intrude upon, to a certain extent, on Mr. Mukherjee's work, which was recently published by the museum, about the entire background and other details relevant to this particular group of the museum's precious possession. We were dealing with only the art aesthetic aspect of the figure at that time without knowing the true background. I will tell you a little more about that now. And then when I was requested, I was asked by Mr. Mukherjee, so I thought, what subject should I take up? I thought that it would be extremely relevant if I take up the question of how, I have gained from this museum. I have got, totally enriched by its collection. I have learned so much from the learned publications that the museum took upon from the very beginning and continue with full gusto under the leadership of Sabyasachi Mukherjee. For the last few years, I have become also almost an annual visitor, to the museum, speaking on something or the other. And in that way, I also got some of my old friends, through whose association I have also learned so much. Some of them are present here, and I feel really proud, privileged, that some of them came all the way from distant places only for this occasion. I have chosen just 5 objects for special attention, with specifically, emphasizing upon the fact that how, they have influenced my thought process, my thinking, and also in that way opened up new channels of inquiry. Almost all these 5 objects are known to you, but you may not have given them, the kind of attention that I am giving now, for the simple reason that there are so many. This museum is a real treasure house. Not that it possesses an extensive and huge collection like some of the leading museums in the world, British Museum or the Louvre or the Victoria and Albert Museum or the Metropolitan Museum. It's not a sort of universal museum in that sense. But still, within its limitations, it has got objects which really open up the frontiers of knowledge to a large extent, not only of this country, but also many others. Happily, the museum, almost from the very beginning, was very lucky, I would say, for its position in the right center of the city, and secondly, of the huge grounds that was allocated to the museum by its planners, which is unthinkable. And you have already been told by the earlier lectures that how the museum flourished through the beneficiary attention to many of the important citizens of this city. Now, I will deal with 5 objects, and this is a purely personal Odyssey. This is my own, idea that developed through these objects. Some of them I could pursue further, and some of them I had to leave almost halfway through to be taken up by others, and fortunately they have been getting attention by the modern scholars. But what is important, a museum is basically known, from its collection. And the background story of how the collections are made, how the collections are displayed, how the collections are preserved, and how they are presented to the public, to the people, and irrespective of class, caste, age, or any other consideration. But basically, the old idea was that it was basically to instigate a kind of sense of inquiry. Broadly, education, in the broadest sense of the term. But gradually with that came the idea of a kind of entertainment, that unless the museum objects, provide sufficient enthusiasm, they may not attract all levels of people. But what happens that in that process we sometimes overlook some of the objects which are extremely important, either from a historical perspective or from an artistic perspective or from some other aspect in which they are intertwined with the development of the Indian culture and civilization. The objects I have chosen are, firstly, from that 1960 visit, the 2 objects that attracted my attention very much. The first one is the 9th minor rock edict of Ashoka that was discovered just a few years before that from Shopara, or Null Shopara as it now known, and the ancient name was Shurparako. Now, the 8th minor rock edict was discovered by Bhagwan Lal Indraji in 1892. And ultimately, it came to the museum because things were all deposited in the Asiatic Society. And when the museum opened its door, or just before it opened doors, the nucleus of the archaeological section was through this, and also what Henry Cousins, as the superintendent of the Western Circle, and he had a huge area under his control, what he collected on behalf of the Archaeological Survey of India. These mostly came, and they form the nucleus of the sort of archaeological collection of the museum. Now, the 9th minor rock edict, as you would see, is not a terribly attractive object. So, one can easily overlook them without knowing their true importance. But we all know that Ashokan edict are mostly on pillars and living rocks. There are few objects which are transportable. And these minor rock edicts, and there is a set of 12 of them, were found completely in Girnar in Gujarat. But in Sopara, when the 8th edict was discovered by Bhagwan Lal Indraji, near a pond very close to the town of Sopara. It was believed that other objects may also be there, may also be found. But unfortunately, nothing happened before 1956, when N.A. Gore, the then librarian of the Asiatic Society of Bombay, he found one, from the side of a pond, a few miles away from the earlier find spot. Now, the 9th rock edict of Ashoka is a very important, document of not only Ashoka's history, but also, what King Ashoka actually wanted to not propagate or teach, but point out to the people at large of this whole country. And There, in the gallery, of course, you will find the entire edict is deciphered both in English and in Marathi. And those of you who may have escaped, whose attention may have escaped, may during in course of your next visit, please do have a closer look and realize its importance, that it was inscribed almost 2500 years before, and the words that Ashoka, wanted to convey through this rock edicts are relevant even now. I will read some of it. That in the edict he says, Devanam Piyodoshi, that people were in the habit of performing mangalas, rituals. And on which occasions of sickness, marriages, on the birth of sons, and embarking upon a long journey. And it's the womenkind in who are accustomed to performing diverse kind of rituals along with that. We all realize we all almost do the same thing or similar thing even now. Ashoka opines that such mangalas are of dubious efficacy. He points out that there is a mangala, the Dhamma Mangala, about the efficacy of which there is no doubt, as it brings good result in this world as well as in the next. So it actually reads, Devanam Piye Piyadashi Raja Evam Ah. And other such occasions men perform many ceremonies. People perform various ceremonies or mangalas, as I have said, during illness, at the marriage of a son or a daughter, at the birth of a child, and when setting out on a journey. On these and other such occasions, people perform many ceremonies. But in such cases, mothers and wives perform many more. Now, ceremonies should certainly be performed, Asok says, but these bear little fruit. The following, however, bear much fruit. So he advises the practice of Dhamma, like proper courtesy to dasas and servants, employees, reverence to elders, gentleness to animals, and liberality, dhanam, to brahmanas and sramanas. These and other virtues are called true Dhamma. Therefore, a father or a son, unfortunately, the inscription is damaged beyond that, and we know from other inscriptions the text, but here it ends. And as you all know, that Chopara, those who are students of history know it very well, that Chopara is one of the earliest settlements in this part of the country. It was away slightly further from the sea on the bank of or confluence of two rivers, so it was protected, and it prospered so much that it finds mention in that very important work called Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And there, Chopara is mentioned, and those of you who are interested to know more about Chopara and the importance of the Ashokan inscription would do well to read a very important publication brought out a few years back by the museum, Dr. M.K. Dhawalikar's Cultural Heritage of Mumbai. The book is still available, and I would strongly urge all of you Mumbaikars, to at least have a look at the book. Because Mumbaikars are very conscious about the heritage of the city, but most of the interest in their heritage, ends up in the 19th century buildings that easily attracts one's eyes. But Mumbai is much more than that. Not only Chopara, but also, Kanheri, Elephanta, and Kalyana. Kalyani is in fact mentioned in the Periplus. And I would urge, you know, to all of them to spare some time and visit these extremely important places. Some of them are unfortunately, when we last visited 2 or 3 years back, very neglected. You know, they are very neglected, and most of them are occupied by people and completely oblivious of their extreme importance in the history of Shaivism, in the history of Shakta, and also before that the Buddhism. So Bombay is actually much older in that respect to Delhi. I mean, by Delhi we mean a conglomerate of different cities that grew up in different parts. But Bombay, had a unique continuity of history right from the time of the pre-Buddhist phase. So these aspects is often forgotten. But this, by drawing your attention to these small, objects which are there in the gallery, the recent revamp of the gallery has done real justice to it with nice artwork and detailed labeling. But still, not very many visitors are aware of that. People are very familiar with Gharapuri or Elephanta and some of the objects that were transported from Elephanta to here and also to Bahuda Jilad museum. And Elephanta has got so many types and so many different kinds of antiquities. But people go there, but they don't really realize the real history of the place and how it was integrated with the history of the region. The second object that I have chosen is, I am intruding on Mr. Mukherjee's field in that sense that he has recently, published a book, and I would request all of you to go through it. There you will find how beautifully he has not only spoken on the sculptures. This is a detail, from the... So my second object is an extremely familiar object, to the museum people, and not only of the people who are visiting here, but also students of Indian art everywhere. Because the object belongs to a almost completely dilapidated and neglected stupa that was found in the middle of the 19th century. And then, like Mohenjo-daro, it also had a very sort of unfortunate past, that the railway contractors were taking all the bricks one by one to build their own, railway track. So in that way, the stupa suffered immensely. But fortunately, that process was stopped. But as Mr. Mukherjee has noted in his book, unfortunately, all that, that was done in course of more than 100 years have been completely, have disappeared in course of the last 1 decade, where people did not pay any attention to the heritage, and virtually almost nothing remains of the stupa. So this particular collection in the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya are the almost only remnant of that extremely important stupa that was built in the 5th century. I mean, we at that time when we first came in, we thought it was slightly later, but as Mr. Mukherjee has shown in the book, that this can be even dated a little earlier in the 5th century. Now, what is important about this particular image is that it's built on terracotta. Because in that part of Sindh Valley, there was not much of, it was a alluvial area, and stone was not easily available. So the makers of the stupa used to decorate the four sides of it with beautiful images, and these images were made of terracotta. And after that there was a sort of slip or a kind of polish, and part of it was also very faintly but at the same time very beautifully colored with almost hints of color. So they are mostly Dhyani Buddhas and of a very wide range of variety. And there were not only Buddhist figures but also, uh, semi-religious figures and other things, and many of them are on display in the gallery. But the museum holds a much bigger collection, and uh, a detailed description of these you will find in the book that Mr. Mukherjee has published. Now, what is important, so at that time when we first came in, we were really looking at from the stylistic point of view. And it was important because it has got all the post-Gupta elements mixed with Gandhara. So here is, one particular site where we find the confluence. Later on, we found the same thing in Mathura also. Maybe the process actually started a little early there, but it continued, and it continued to Sarnath in the east. But in the west, in Mirpur, Khas, or Kahuja Daro, its true name of the stupa, are extremely important. In a way, they recollect some of the stucco and terracotta sculptures of Pandukistan and other sites of Afghanistan and Pakistan border area. But this one, as you could see, is an epitome of the sculptural art. It's such a beautiful image, and I am not going into the details. The details are to be found in the book. I am only drawing your attention to the extremely important and beautiful image that this museum proudly possesses. And this attracted our attention because there was only a small black and white picture in Benjamin Rowland's book. And the full report was not very easily available, Henry Cousin's report. But we did see it in the library of the Archaeological Survey of India in Kolkata. And our teacher, when Dr. Niharanjan Ray, when he heard that we are coming to Mumbai, he said, have a good look at this figure. And at that time, not only this, there were 3 other figures that were on display. Now, in the book, Mr. Mukherjee has dealt all of them. I will show. Now, this is the oldest picture, oldest photograph that was published in the memoirs and also in the Archaeological Survey annual report after the excavations that were done by Henry Cousins. You could see these are the sort of niches where these particular figures were placed. Now nothing remains of this stupa. Now there is a chart in the book where the sculptures are there in the parallel in the facing page, the indication that where actually those sculptures were placed in the niches in different sides of the stupa. This is one, another picture, another sculpture of immense importance and beauty. Those students of aesthetic arts and aesthetics and also iconography would find a lot. And Mr. Mukherjee has discussed many of these things in the book. This is another figure. And perhaps the most enigmatic figure we find here is this secular one. And I also agree with the suggestion that he must be the donor, the rich, Buddhist, the trader who had the means to spend to erecting such an important stupa and had the taste. And if you look at the figure, I am sure, one of the finest secular figures in the entire range of Indian art history. The third painting, the third thing I have selected, for this talk this evening is a painting, that shows Emperor Jahangir, who came to the throne in 1605 and died in late 1627. Now, this particular page is from Jahangir Nama, or the book that Jahangir himself wrote, his autobiography called the Tuzuk-i-Jahangiri. Now, when the Tuzuk was, he kept in the longhand his own writings as far as he could, because he gave the duty to some of his closer persons when he could no longer write. His, hands were trembling. He took too much of opium and arrak. Now, this particular page came to the museum in 1929, and it was purchased from the collection of late Rao Bahadur Parausins of Satara. And it is believed, I don't know very sure, but it's a beautiful album page, as you could see from the hashia or the mounts of the page. So it's believed to be from the album that was acquired by Nana Furnish, from the later Mughal successors of Delhi. Now, he was a big collector, and quite a few of his things are in the museum. But this particular, my association actually started before I really had a good look of it. When I came in 1960, I did look at it, but I had not much of interest, because I was being a student of Indology, not of Mughal painting at that stage. So that starts a new phase of my own life, that when I went back after my museology and all these things, then suddenly I got a job in the Indian Museum. And there I was away from Indology and archaeology, from coins, inscriptions and sculptures. Because in the first floor of the Indian Museum, there is what is called as the textiles, decorative art and art painting gallery. So that became, my area of work, about which I had not much but little knowledge. Then I got a very rare opportunity of getting a Commonwealth scholarship to go all the way to England. And initially, when I put up my application, I wrote Jain iconography, because I was very much influenced with Umakant Bhai's work of Jainism in Eastern India and his book. And the scholarship that was available at that time in the Kolkata University was exclusively devoted to Jain studies. But the supervisor to whom I was allocated flatly refused to entertain me, because he said, you don't know anything of Pali or Prakrit or Ardhamagadi, without which I cannot do any work in Jainism. So I, putting up a brave face, I said, I know Sanskrit, so I could definitely, given some time, I could get it. He said, no, you can't master it to that extent that you will be able to read manuscripts of 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. Anyway, so at that point of time, I thought that it's perhaps better that when I have got a chance to go all the way to England for 3 years, why not take up a subject in which, our objects are mostly found there? And that subject was Mughal painting. Because most of the Mughal illustrated manuscripts and albums are to be found in Iran, in the collections of the British Library, Victoria and Albert Museum, British Museum, and Chester Beatty Museum. And there, before I actually left, I was given a long time, of almost 7 months' time, and my mentor, Dr. Niharanjan Rai, told me to meet at least 3 important people, before I go there. One was Rai Krishnadas ji, the second one was Sivaramamurthy, who just published a book on Indian painting at that time, and the third one was Dr. Moti Chandra. So I met them, came here, spent almost 7 days, 5 to 7 days in each place. I had a sort of small box camera type of camera, and I got almost free access. And they told so many important, clues and hints and references that changed the entire course of my life. So this particular, and at that time the second edition of Dr. Moti Chandra's book, that small book, Indian Art, came, and this painting was illustrated in color, as I think plate 33. Now, when I went and started my work, and then I noticed that Jahangir visited Ajmer, and he stayed there for almost 3 years. And in course of his 3 years' time, he visited the Dargah Sharif of Khaja Muinuddin Chishti 14 times. But only 3 of these visits are described in detail, and another 3 just mentioned, but not much detail of his other visits are known. So when I was ultimately, writing my dissertation and published my book, I was not 100% sure about the specific occasion, because there are 2 important points to be noted. And one is that this is a sort of festival in which, because Jahangir donated, like his father Akbar, who presented a huge deg, cooking pot of brass to cook biryani to be distributed at the festival of Urs of Khaja Muinuddin Chishti. So Jahangir also ordered another, slightly smaller than the other one, and that was there. And when this ultimately arrived from Agra after fabrication, so there was a big festivity, and Jahangir mentions in his diary that he went there and all the cooked food was distributed amongst the needy, amongst the Sufis, amongst the teachers, and amongst other people. And not only that, they were all given 1 coin by him. So here we see Jahangir seated there, with all the royal paraphernalia, with his entourage, and there we find. And in the background, there was the scene of the Dargah Sharif, and also in the background, part of Anasagar Lake is also visible, and the hilly region. Now, there was one difficulty at that time, I couldn't explain, but it can now be explained. And maybe that's the reason why Moti Chandra, when it was catalogued, he gave it the date 1630. Which one? Light. Anyway, so what happened that there, the day in which this particular festivity took place, as described in the Tujuk, this fellow is Khurram, and this fellow is Prince Karan, the Prince of Mewar. They are shown here. But the day in which the deg was, used for the first time, and the festivity that Jahangir describes in detail in his book, these 2 people were not supposed to be present there. because just a few days before that, Khurram left for the Mewar campaign, and after about almost 19 months, he returned with the prince. So that's one of the reasons why sometimes, I think Dr. Moti Chandra believed that it may have been done at a later date. That's why in the museum catalogue it was written as 1630, but the actual festivity occurred in the 1616. But then I speculated in my book that it was not that particular urs that was described in the Tuzuk, but another occasion, because he stayed there for 3 years. And after the return from Mewar campaign of Khurram and Prince Karan of Mewar, he stayed for another 9 or 10 months there. So maybe it's another visit which has not been recorded in the book. Anyway, these are moot points. Not really necessary to appreciate the beauty and the importance of this particular painting. I have some details that I will show you. We don't know the name of the artist, but we find, that the style is very close to the work of some of the very well-known artists who were active at that time. Now, if you look at some of the figures, how carefully they have been done, each one of them are almost recognizable. So the portraits were done with very good care. Not only that they were paying attention to the nobility and to the emperor and his entourage, but also the entire crowd that have assembled there. And if you look at the upper part of the painting, you would notice how they have tried to indicate the perspective. Now, here you see that Jahangir is actually sitting on a throne which has a European motif there. And at that time, we know from his account that a lot of European traders and envoys were visiting the Mughal court. And they were coming, and along with that, there were even European craftsmen that were invited at the Mughal court. So there are detailed accounts of golden thrones that were fabricated by Europeans, which were used by Jahangir. So this is one of them. And then there are also detailed descriptions of floor spreads and carpets. So we have actually, this type of carpet with figures of birds and others on the borders. And in the Shamiana, you could see that how beautifully, the velvets, it's going on in its own way. So that particular Shamiana is very interesting because we have very few actual examples surviving, in some of the European collections. But these are actually not copied, but followed from the Iranian tradition of brocades and velvet making that the Mughal court ultimately excelled, and ultimately it became an important part of Indian textile history. Now I showed that how they tried to indicate the perspective, what was happening far behind where Jahangir was sitting outside the main gate. And there inside the Dargah, the Khaja Moinuddin Chisti's mausoleum is visible here in a beautiful way. Now the fourth object that I am going to discuss in a tiny piece of jade. And this particular piece is it was acquired in 1966. It came as a gift of Sri Muzin K. Esaji, who I believe has donated, a lot of things. But in the catalogue, it's mentioned that in memory of his father, I would very much I would be very happy that his father's name is also mentioned, because it's in memory of his father, total unknown people. So maybe we would try to do that. But what is important about this particular jade, that it's a very enigmatic object. What is its true function? There are a lot of speculation. Since its acquisition in 1966, it drew the collection of very important scholars who have worked on Mughal and Iranian jades, starting with Robert Skelton, my guru. And Robert first published it in 1972, then he included this one in his landmark exhibition of 1982 of the Festival of India in the UK, called Mughal Court and Life through and the Mughal heritage. And this was included for this reason. Not only it had got importance from 4 different aspects. Number one, it's an object which bears a very important inscription, inscribed in beautiful nostalgic script. And the inscription reads that Surate Itman, no, not this one, but anyway, it says that it was made from a Yasam-e-Nilab. Yasam is the Persian word for jade. But the important word that was deciphered by Jade Desai, because initially in the accession register it was mentioned as undeciphered. And it was published also by Rosemary in the Indian Heritage Catalogue as undeciphered. But then it was deciphered by the great Jade Desai, that Yasam-e-Nilab. Now Yasam-e-Nilab means that this particular jade pebble from which this perfume bottle or pen dryer or object, whatever it is, I will talk about it a little more, was found in the bank of river Indus. See, normally 99.9% of the jades that came to the Mughal court, from which they fabricated a lot of jade vessels, came from the only place from where these were found out in Chinese Turkestan. So jade used to come in different colors and color combinations, and we have quite a few even in the museum gallery that were fabricated during Mughal time. So they are easily overlooked because they don't carry any inscription. But this one is important because it carries an inscription and a date. And the date is also very important. It is 1626-27. That means the last year of Jahangir's reign. So, the 4th reason why it's important is also it ushers in a new trend in jade carving tradition of India. Previously, all the jades that were used with Mughal inscriptions, used from Akbar's time to Shah Jahan's time, are all follow the kind of Iranian or Central Asian tradition. Now this one does not follow that. It's an organic object, it's a champa kali. It's the bud of the champak flower. So this type of jade was never produced at the Mughal court before this tiny piece was done. Secondly, it's important is what is its use? We are not very sure. So Rai Krishnadas ji, when it was first acquired, he thought that it's a pen dryer, pen nib dryer that the calligraphers used, and maybe because Jahangir also used to write his own biography, maybe he also used it. But mind you, this is dated in the last years of his reign, when he was no longer keeping his diary. He was not in a position to do that. 3 years before that, his diary ends. Second option was that it was Robert Skelton who suggested, and he followed also the jade scholar Mumin Latif, that it might be an ether dan, because it shows a fragrant flower, champaka. So it's quite natural that it can be used as a container of ether. But then this does not have that kind of cavity inside it to hold ether. So then it was suggested, I think by Kalpana, in the Masterpieces catalog, that it was used as a kind of string end that the Mughals used in their scabbard of their sword. So often we find that there are small pieces, like at the end of the kimono thread, there are pieces of jade or metal or other smaller things. So this one might be a kind of pendulum that was used. And this is further strengthened by the discovery of another similar jade in the museum, State Museum, Lucknow. You see, unfortunately, I couldn't find out the acquisition details of the Lucknow object. But it's known almost for certain that these objects ultimately came out of Lucknow, where most of the Mughal treasury objects arrived after Nadir Shah's loot of Delhi. And there is another object I will show you, this particular one, which was carved about 15 years earlier. It's in the Metropolitan Museum. It's carved out of a solid piece of rock, jade, in deep green color. And it has got absolutely fabulous inscriptions and carvings upon it. And fortunately, there is a tiny inscription at the base of the piece, which unfortunately I don't have a slide, where it's written that made by Mumin Jahangiri. And he gives the date 1616. So Mumin Jahangiri, we don't know whether it was an Iranian working here or he was one of the earliest jade carvers that were trained in the Iranian tradition. But here, what he has done, that he has decorated it in a kind of carved on the surface. Now, jade is a very hard substance. It's extremely difficult to carve a piece of jade to the required shape. And not only that, then it is decorated, and also you could see the inscription. And the inscription is quite long, and it's mentioned that Surate Itman Yaft आज Jahangir Shah Akbar Shah Dar Sannat 14 Jalush, 14th year of his reign, Mutabik e Sannat 1028 Hijri, and he mentioned that it was, and the Metropolitan Museum, they were a bit forward than us in that source, that it was sourced from one Kashinath of Lucknow until 1904, from which it came to Ganeshilal and son of Agra, and then bought from Agra by George Co. Graves of Osterville, who donated it to the museum, Metropolitan Museum, in 1929. So we have got sure evidence of coming from Lucknow with an inscription which is very similar to our jade in the Prince of Wales Museum. And the third piece, the parallel piece of this one, is sitting in Lucknow. So maybe, the Mughal treasury, as it came from Lucknow, so we don't know exactly from where our piece came, but I would speculate that this also came from the same source. We have no means of knowing where Esaji found it and when and how he acquired it. Now, before deciding on the fifth object, I was in hesitating that what to select, because I had 4 important candidates. By that time, I have visited the museum many times and seen some of its important collections. But one particular object which I was not familiar with, but later on I came to know through the publication of my another mentor, Simon Digby. Now that was the, before that, the first candidate was, of course, this extremely important but not very large, bronze from Eastern India, of Jain Parshanath. And because at that time I told you that I was trying to do something on Jaina art. So this, in my 1960 visit, it was very important for me. But then I thought, but maybe this is not my cup of tea. So I would leave it to other senior scholars, some of whom are just sitting in front of me. The next object is another extremely important possession of this museum. They are not very large in size, but they are very important for 2 reasons: that they come from, it's in the form of a triptych, and it shows a particular episode that has been, well known from and well appointed. It received the scholarly attention from the very beginning of its possession. And this is one of the best preserved ivory carving from Kashmir, and first written by Moti Chandra in the Bulletin, and later on it was published by many scholars because of its similarity with other figures coming from Kashmir, because of its importance of Buddhist iconographical details. The third object, which I thought I would draw your attention to, is a copper and very richly embellished with carvings and inscriptions of a copper bowl or a deg. Now, we don't know exactly its exact purpose because it has so many important features. But for me, this has importance for some completely different reason, completely personal reason. That Simon Digby, who was a very eminent scholar, mainly specializing in coins, inscriptions, and metalware, and related objects, which are often neglected by art historians from Sultanate period as well as Mughal period. And he built up his own small collection, which was ultimately donated. Now, this particular piece he published in Bulletin 5. And I was not very much aware of it. I didn't see it during my visit. But it became, a kind of deeper attention for me for one personal reason. That in 1967, when I completed my dissertation and I was called for my viva in the Senate House of the University of London, I didn't know that in the reception Simon Digby was waiting for me. So when ultimately after the interview, before the formal declaration, when my examiners shook my hand and said, "Well done, Dr. Das," so I was very happy. When I came out, I found Simon Digby waiting with a jewela, and he immediately brought out a booklet, small upprint of the Bulletin article, where he inscribed Dr. Das, Simon Digby, September 1967. So this is the first time I found my name with the prefix. So that's the reason. Then I noticed that, he has dealt with this particular thing along with other metalware of the museum, which were often neglected by the people. But then I thought again, it's a completely Some of the details are astounding. And the other day, when Vandana and Manisha were there showing me some of the objects, closely, I was really feeling that, well, we have neglected this particular field of decorative art very much. And this particular one is a dated one. It is dated 1605. And then it has got a kind of knob on the top, which was fixed at the bottom, inside bottom of the piece. So we really don't know. So Manisha thought that maybe it was used as a kind of vessel for preparing medicine, but we don't know. But definitely for an ordinary cooking vessel, this type of thing wouldn't be made. But the final vote went for this particular piece, my fifth object. And here again I am intruding upon Manisha's work and also my wife's work, in this particular field, Baluchari silk from Banaras. For the simple reason that it has got very close association with the Tagore family. And if that particular association is very firmly established, I think we will have to make a little more inquiry about that. Then this would help us to build up a proper chronology of this very short-lived and important silk weaving tradition of Bengal, the Baluchari silk. Because we know from the history of Baluchari silk actually starts from the end. Because we know very much about the last phase of the Baluchari, who were the last great weavers, how things were discontinued. This has been recorded by important observers and scholars of the time. But about that beginning, when actually it started, how it was started, who gave that idea of incorporating detailed, some of these details, with so much intricacy. And the weaving of a Baluchari silk is an extremely difficult process, like all, valuable textiles like velvet or like even a good kalamkari and other things undergoes so many processes before getting the final piece. Now, in the museum record, it's mentioned that it was acquired by the present Director General from Calcutta, from the family of the second brother of poet Tagore, Satyendranath Tagore, and his wife Ganadhar Nandini Devi. That it was an heirloom that they got, from generations. And it is believed that Ganadhar Nandini Devi acquired it and presented it to her daughter-in-law, Surendranath Tagore, Sanga Devi, during the time of their wedding. Now, then it came, the later on to others that I will tell you, but that is well recorded here. But what is important is that Ganadhar Nandini Devi was a very unusual personality. She introduced a new style of textile, sari wearing in Bengal. And not only that, she was pioneering with women's rights, women's education and other things. And also, what is unknown to many, that she was also an author. And this is the cover of a children's book that she wrote, Tak Duma Dum Dum. So the illustration is by Nandalal Bose and it was published by Vishwabharati, Ganadhar Nandini's work. Now about that Baluchari, it has got many salient and important features. I am not going into the details. This will be done later on by the scholars whose books are waiting. But some of the details are so interesting that they immediately remind us of the shawls from Kashmir or from other types of textiles produced at the Mughal court. But another important feature is this railway carriage. Now, the incorporation, the very idea of incorporating a railway carriage with European passengers in a piece of textile is revolutionary, I should say. It has never happened. But how, for whom they were made? But it became a standard feature, and the museum, our museum, Chhatrapati Shivaji Museum, has another piece, which is very close, very similar to this one. And that came to the collection from Kamala Dongarkari, who herself wrote a book on Indian saris and was a collector herself. So I don't know, when, no, we know when exactly it was done. But the important feature of this is the assemblage of that motif, around the central square, rectangle that consists of those 5 kolkas or kolgis or paisley, whatever you call them, and how stylized they are. So this is done in this one as well as the other one. So the museum actually has got a pair of very similarly designed but differently colored Baluchari silk, which needs further attention of the visitors. So I end, my personal Odyssey with this, that right from 1960 till today, I have learned so much from the museum with its variety of objects, with its importance and, historical importance, artistic, aesthetic appeal, and also their place in the history of Indian art and culture. So I feel very glad that I am here to relate some of my own experiences, in this way. Thank you very much.